Hey guys! If you've been around the internet and you've followed Worldcon drama like even remotely over the last couple of weeks, well, you've probably been hearing a lot of talk about this.
Joseph Campbell, for whom this award was named, was a fucking fascist. He's responsible for setting a tone for science fiction that haunts this genre to this very day. Stale, sterile, male, white, exalting in the ambitions of imperialists, colonialists, settlers, and industrialists.
So let's talk about it. When Jeannette Ng won her Campbell Award, she went up and gave this really compelling speech. It was a really interesting call to attention to something that I think we don't nearly talk enough about in the science fiction community, and that is imperialism. So we hear a lot about culture wars, we hear a lot about like the changing way in PC culture and cancel culture, but we don't talk a lot about imperialism itself, or certainly not enough. In Ng's speech, she doesn't just call out John Campbell. She calls out the science fiction community as a whole for not doing enough to address its imperialist roots. And this is a really, I think, important and really quite thoughtful claim. So let's talk about imperialism and how it's affected science fiction. As you guys know, I'm a big believer that science fiction is the playground for politics. It is a fantastic format that gives us the tools and the insight to really explore how people interact with governance and the way we interact with one another. That's why we see these fantastic political thoughts kind of being championed and all cited back to things like Heinlein or Asimov. It's because we're taking this opportunity to really explore human nature and its relationship with governance. I think this is a conversation that's especially interesting because not only are we looking at politics, are we looking at science fiction's history, but we're looking at the underlying assumptions that shape a lot of the narratives that we see in science fiction, and I'll talk in a minute about why. But first, like with all of these videos, let's do a quick lesson about political theory. So imperialism and colonialism are far from new concepts, and most of us are taught the basics of it in school. So I think we can generally say that imperialism is a political attitude or viewpoint that seeks expansion of a country or a culture into new territories, regardless of if that territory is occupied or has a fully fledged governance system. Imperialists see the expansion of state borders as a kind of inherent good. It's directly connected to their worthiness, to their growth of country, state, nation. Many of us are probably familiar with imperialism in its kind of peak, most pinnacle form, which is the expansion of Europe into Africa, which divided Africa into hundreds of colonies and nations over the course of the roughly 1880s to 1930s. In addition to that, you have the classic example of Britain and India. I do want to make the distinction between imperialism and colonialism, although you often hear them interchangeably used because, well, frankly, they are buxom buddies. They go together like peanut butter and jelly. Colonialism is quite similar to imperialism, which is why they show up together. Colonialism is a political viewpoint that prioritizes a country's expansion into new territories, specifically for the use of resources. Think natural resources, think strategic value, and even people. Colonialism largely focuses on the use of these resources for the benefit of the colonizing country. Colonizing countries believe themselves to be somehow superior, and so they use these resources without much regard for the native people's beliefs, religion, or needs. There are a number of common examples that you've probably heard of. For instance, the use of agriculture and the fur trade when Europeans came over to Americas for the first time. The exploitation of spice resources and rubber throughout the Africas, and similar exploitation of people from, well, a lot of places. These terms are nuanced in their distinctions, but I think it's important to keep that in mind as we have a conversation about the cultural shift and the power dynamics involved in imperialism. The problem with imperialism and colonialism is that it has a very long-lasting and insidious effect. Technically, with the closure of the Trusteeship Council from the United Nations in 1994, there aren't really any formally recognized colonies by the international community anymore. That certainly doesn't mean that they don't exist. And for even those that are disbanded, you see huge impacts on their ongoing culture. For instance, right here in the United States, you see conflicts all the time over water use and pipelines for the government and native populations. That's a classic example of imperialism continuing on into this day. And it's also very clear what culture has kind of won this imperialist war based on the way that the average person understands the conflict and how the news media covers it. Similar conflicts continue on throughout Australia with their indigenous populations, the Aboriginal population. You see the similar conflicts between traditionally colonized areas of India and Africa. In fact, African conflict on the continent itself can be in many ways seen as a lasting impact of imperialism. Also important is to recognize the way that we've recorded this dialogue throughout history. Anthropologists use a tool called ethnography. What this means is that somebody comes into a new culture and studies that culture. Problem being that person is fundamentally an outsider and lacks the context and really insight to understand why certain events might happen. When they go back to their country, they bring that ethnography, which often informs policy, belief, and cultural narrative about others. It can get so bad that we completely mythologize people, leading to the kind of racist stereotypes we see today. Because that reporting lacks the full context of the culture and society, we go in and we make decisions that, simply put, don't work in our favor. The counterpoint to this is autoethnography, which is a reporting about one's own culture, often directly rebutting ethnographies that have been impactful for society. This provides cultural insight about the kind of colonized people. The issue, of course, being that because they are colonized, they often have less of a voice in the population. Autoethnography, this kind of self-representation, is often seen as lesser or ill-informed or somehow not professional or academic enough. It's actually really exciting because right now in science fiction and fantasy, we're seeing this really cool autoethnographic aspect of our fiction, and that's in the Own Voices movement. The Own Voices movement promotes people who are from some form of minority population who are writing about their own experiences, writing in the context of their own lived experiences, even if they're not writing directly about their own culture. This is a fantastic way that we see kind of this rebutting slowly of the imperialist assumptions that we have in our dominant culture through fiction. If you're interested in reading a little bit more about kind of the issues with imperialism and colonialism, I think a really fantastic resource is Historical Metaphors and Mythical Realities. This is a book by Marshall Sahlins, and it's really, really tiny. What this book does is it looks at the presence of Cook and the Cook expedition into the Hawaiian Islands. The first time through, when the crew arrived, they were received very warmly and seen as gods. They were given everything they wanted. But there was no extension to understand the cultural context of that, and so when they came back, it disrupted the mythologizing of the Hawaiian people who had seen them as gods who cycle through society, and so they killed them. It was that kind of ignorance that is at issue in a lot of colonialism, imperialism, and the resulting narratives. It's things that we can only go and understand through a broader context. So let's connect this to science fiction directly. Science fiction and fantasy stem from this desire to expand and explore. That's the fundamental kind of prototypical science fiction story, right? We go out into the stars and we conquer this new planet, and maybe there are aliens and probably we fight them and we win because we're awesome humans. And let's not pretend that there isn't an appeal to that. I find so much of those kind of stories inspiring because they encourage us to go out and be more than who we are now. That there is something out there, that there are additional challenges, additional things to learn. It's a fantastic aspect of science fiction that I find really inspiring. But there's a contrasting point in that, which is that in many of these narratives, we approach planets and new spaces with this idea of going in and conquering the new land, finding out the new mysteries without waiting to find out the context. And so the patterns in that are eerily similar to imperialism and colonialism. We engage with those new spaces in a way that is not necessarily regarding the well-being or health of the ecosystem, of the indigenous peoples, or really without the understanding of what's going on at large. There's a tendency to kind of Captain Kirk it up. And you see this in a lot of stories, for instance, The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. And in addition to the way that this affects the approach we have to stories and to new worlds, which just has that uncomfortable, like, history will repeat itself feeling, it also shows very clearly in the voices that we lift up within the science fiction community. Let's face it, who were the grand kings, the real winners of imperialism? Traditionally were rich white men, especially rich white men who were landed. And in modern science fiction, we still see that influence. And while I firmly believe that everyone should be able to contribute to our community, and I very much appreciate a number of the stories that come out from people who fit this mold, those are not the only stories, and they shouldn't be read at the expense of others. They shouldn't be published at the expense of voices that would traditionally be dominated. Women, people of color, people of the LGBTQ community. We're slowly seeing a shift in science fiction fandom's approach to dominated voices that I find really encouraging. And we're seeing kind of a willingness to look at that presumption that go in and take over the Captain Kirkness of the world, so to speak, that I find really encouraging, that has made space for new voices and that continues to do that. I'm really excited personally to see that grow. And so in true booktube fashion, I want to know what you think about this and about the role of imperialism in the science fiction community. And moreover, I'm going to leave you with some book recommendations that'll help you think about it. So I have selected a number of books that I think deal with imperialism in one form or fashion, and that I think are really thought-provoking. Some of these are books that you will have heard me talk about before or heard me recommend. That's kind of because this is, of course, where my interests lie. There's a cat now. I have my pumpkins, my jack-o'-lantern bow tie. So let's get to it. First is one that is probably pretty predictable for me. It's a book that I recommend all the time and that I find very thought-provoking, engaging, and that for me has value every time I go back. And that is The Word for World is Forest by Ursula Le Guin. It's a relatively short book that looks at the role of a new mining colony on a planet. The humans have arrived there and begin to log the new area because wood is pretty sparse. And they do so really without consulting the native population. I think this is a really interesting look at the direct impact that imperialism can have on the colonized and that the kind of voices that we raise up through that process. The next book I have is A Door into Ocean. This is by Joan, I can never say her last name. It's Joan Slonczewski. I can never say her last name right. And this is about a planet that has been isolated from the kind of multi-planet federation that rules the area. And when that federation comes in to use the resources that are available on the planet, the native inhabitants are, well, in pretty direct conflict. They are an entirely marine, all-female, and entirely pacifistic culture, and so of course interesting conversations happen there. I think this is a really interesting exploration of how certain thought processes are seen as legitimate or not legitimate based on who offers them up. In books that directly talk about the colonialism of Africa, we have Nisi Shawl's Everfair. This is really beautiful prose and examines it examines the lives of a number of people who have kind of a magical ability. It's set in what is essentially the Congo in a steampunk version of the colonial era. I also want to make sure that I point out The Windup Girl by Paolo Bacigalupi. This is an interesting story that's based in Thailand and Bangkok, and it involves kind of this long-term effect of global warming, but also the societal expectations that have developed in Thailand over time that I think incorporates some imperialism and colonialism elements that you might find interesting. And then the last book I want to recommend to you, I don't actually have a physical copy with me. I had one and now I must have lent it out and like not remembered because I do that all the time. And that is Trail of Lightning by Rebecca Roanhorse. The book is set in the Navajo Nation and has some really interesting things I think to say about how it has some really interesting things to say, I think, about one, how you can be an outsider in your own community and how culture is kind of more complex than it initially seems, but also about kind of life on reservation land, and that has a lot of interesting things that are left for us to think about, I think, especially as Americans. Regardless of what you're reading or when you're reading it, I do think that it's always interesting to ask yourself, what stories do I find appealing? What do I like about them? And what does that tell me about myself, about my cultural assumptions, about the things that I take for granted, and about the way that I approach other people, which are all really the fundamental questions that come out of really looking at science fiction and imperialism. What voices are you interested in? Why are you interested in them? And what can you do to be a kinder, more inclusive human being? There you guys go. I hope you are enjoying the series. I hope that this sounded even remotely cogent. It probably didn't. There's a lot more that could be said about colonialism, about imperialism, and their impact on just society at large and the kind of conversations that we have as people. But I did try to make sure that I hit a lot of the basics for you. If you have questions, leave them down below. Let me know what books you're reading or that you've read that make you think about the structures and power structures in the world. You guys know the drill. Go ahead and comment on the video, like and subscribe. You can go ahead and support the channel over on Instagram and on Twitter. And then a big thank you to my patrons who help make videos like this happen. If you are interested, you can go on over to my Patreon and support the channel there. Patrons get access to early videos and also get to help me pick my TBR for the month. I hope you guys are all having a fantastic reading week, and I'll see you soon. Bye.